Have you noticed something about Chris Bumstead lately? If you take a look at his most recent videos, it becomes really apparent, and even in some of the thumbnails. You remember back when Chris Bumstead got a hair transplant, right? Well, he did, and he was sponsored by a company in Turkey to get that hair transplant, so it was likely free. He might have even gotten paid to get it, which is absolutely bonkers. But there's more to the story now, because if you've seen his recent videos, after he's quit bodybuilding, by the way, he's retired.
I think a lot of people know what's coming. It's with a really bittersweet feeling that this is gonna be my last time up on the stage. The past 8 years up here have been the most amazing journey of my life.
His hair transplant seems to be a little bit less effective. It seems to be almost what I would call thin at this point. And you might be wondering, is someone who could possibly need a hair transplant, or someone using androgens who maybe doesn't want to, ruin their hair transplant after getting it? It's on average about a $3,000 to $15,000 surgery. It's no joke. Even if you go to Turkey, you're paying about $3,000, and the flight over there is about another $1,000 to maybe $2,000. Depending on what class you fly in. It's a pretty spendy material. So I thought I would kind of explain what's happening to Chris Bumstead's head from my perspective as someone who coaches people using anabolics, as well as talks about this stuff on the regular, to maybe give you some insight as to why we're seeing his hair thin a second time now. So if we go back a couple of years ago, Chris Bumstead was definitely losing his hairline. It was nuts. He was showing up on stage with those receded partings going way back onto his forehead. He had like the crowning here that you get, and then like goes all the way up and stuff. People weren't really calling it out. No one was saying anything about it. It was just kind of obvious, and everyone sort of expects it who's in the bodybuilding industry. But I think with Chris Bumstead being more of a general populist kind of guy, like people follow him as a fitness influencer more than a bodybuilder, I think. He probably wanted to sustain his looks and some pretty good hairlines going on, right? But as a repercussion of that, the company reached out to him. They said, hey, we're going to sponsor you, give you a hair transplant. Just let us record the whole process, talk about it on social media for us, and you're good to go. He did that. He got a hair transplant in Turkey. He went with his brother Iain, an open bodybuilder as well, who's also now retired, and they got hair transplants together. Now, fast forward just a little over a year at this point, and the hair transplant should have matured and reached a point in which we're seeing its full effect. A hair transplant isn't like you just go to a place to get the transplant done and you have a full head of hair. Usually you have to, not usually, you do have to shave your head and then have those follicles transplanted from usually like the back of your head and then into your scalp. That process is very laborious and injury prone. So you have a bloody scalp for some time, you have to heal that scalp.
The procedure is pretty painful. You lie on your back and they jab you full of these needles to freeze your head, and that hurt like a fucking beach. It really hurt. They numb your head, and then they start injecting your head full of water, and it's full of like epinephrine as well. So my heart starts racing. I feel like I'm having a panic attack on the bed. And then you lie there face down, and they drill into your head 4,500 times, pulling out one hair at a time, putting in a little petri dish, and you're just like lying there awake, uncomfortable until that's done. And then they flip you over, inject more water and shit in your head, and then they put all those hairs back in one at a time. So there's 9,000 times essentially that they drill into your head, taking the hair in enough. So it's a pretty intense procedure, I'm not gonna lie.
Your hair is going to then grow and shed once again because hair can't sustain that hair. And then ideally what happens after the shedding, once happens again, you grow it back and it's nice and full and luscious and you have a full head of hair, cha-ching, bang, and done. You're attractive now. Except that's not always how it works out. One, there's a high rate of failure with hair transplants. This is something that's not often discussed. While it's stated that an average hair transplant is going to do just fine, about 2% of them totally fail, there is a lot of variety between failures. You can have hair transplants that don't necessarily come on as thick. You can have hair transplants that maybe you lose some areas of the transplant and some stay on, so it can be patchy. There's a lot of different ways to look at hair transplants, and unfortunately you don't really know until you get it done, because part of it is due to the quality of hair transplant done by the specific surgeon. Another part of it is due to the actual hair follicle quality that you have, your genetic variability per se. But one thing is for certain is that where you're going to get the hair transplant, in Chris Bumstead's case on his forehead, he is going to have pre-existing hair follicles there. He did. He certainly did. They were there. I think everyone saw them clear as day. But where the issue lies is once you get that hair transplant, that doesn't immediately save the rest of your scalp from hair loss. So to break this down, when you're taking androgens or just having testosterone in general, testosterone gets converted by an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. This 5-alpha reductase enzyme can be inhibited, but when it's not, it will convert testosterone into DHT, dihydrotestosterone. Now, dihydrotestosterone has a high affinity for androgen receptors, especially in the scalp. Once there and acting on a genomic and non-genomic level within that receptor site, you start to initiate a cascade known as hair follicle miniaturization, and essentially that is as it sounds. A hair follicle begins to shrink to such a degree that it can't sustain a life of a hair follicle anymore. And so what you're left with is, unfortunately, really unfortunately, an entire scalp that doesn't have sustainable hair follicles, and that means balding permanently. It's gone. Shebang. It's good for gone. It's gone, gone, gone.
Damn, I messed up. We gotta go bald, man.
But what people have done over the years is taken medication to counteract this process. This medication is called a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. It's a class of drugs that will inhibit the enzyme I was just talking about that converts testosterone into dihydrotestosterone. It comes with some degree of side effects for individuals that are prone to them, but it's generally innocuous for most human beings to take and can be dosed at a wide variety of different dosages, and it's quite effective. It's really effective, actually. The issue lies when people are taking anabolic steroids, because you're not just taking testosterone most of the time, and that 5-alpha reductase process is going to happen to testosterone, but also to other testosterone derivatives. You have 19-nortestosterone, you have dihydrotestosterone and its derivatives. There's going to be a process of metabolite production that is almost uncontrollable. And so when you start taking a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, for example, you could be taking something like nandrolone, for example, DECA. You've heard of this more than likely. Trend, same thing. Not the same thing, different compound, but you get it. The 5-alpha reductase inhibitor will actually inhibit that conversion process for nandrolone too. But the problem there is that metabolite that's created from that process is actually less androgenic in the sense of binding to an androgen receptor and eliciting a effect such as hair follicle miniaturization. So blocking the process inevitably makes that hair follicle miniaturization happen more, even though you're taking a compound to protect yourself. A bad situation, especially if you're spending a lot of money to save your hairline.
What a waste of money.
One of the things you're told as a guy using higher degrees of testosterone and its derivatives when you get a hair transplant is that you're not going to have hair follicle miniaturization like you would without transplanted hairs. They're basically DHT resistant, which is a good thing. But we run into an issue there. Most of the time when you get a hair transplant, you're not just getting a new hairline entirely. You are putting hairs in a already existing bed of hairs. So the current hairs that you have mixed with the transplanted hairs are still prone to fall out. And so because of this misconception that you can just basically stop protecting your hairline using something like a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, you may stop taking it. Except those exposed follicles are now being bombarded with dihydrotestosterone and many other derivatives that are also androgenic that you might be taking exogenously. In Chris Bumstead's case, it's fair to say that he's likely taking an elevated dose of testosterone after his retirement, not necessarily a full-blown cycle, but still a good dose of gear. And while he's gotten a hair transplant, you can generally assume that that hair transplant has come with a statement saying, hey, you don't have to take your 5-alpha reductase inhibitors anymore, which he's quoted himself saying that he does take those things before, and as a result, an elevated dose of testosterone means an elevated amount of DHT. An elevated amount of DHT means more hair follicles miniaturized. And so we're presented with the Chris Bumstead we have now, an individual that you can see in his videos after a long year plus some of having a hair transplant has ended up with another thinned hairline. This could be a result of more things than just this too. I'm not saying that it's just that he stopped the 5-alpha reductase inhibitor or all hair care because he got this robust hair transplant, it's more than likely partly that, but it could also be the surgeon's fault as well and an improper surgery. It's certainly not a good look for either of them, surgery or Chris Bumstead, but I just think it's an important video to make because you could be doing this very same thing. Or you could be one in 100 guys that I know who are saving up to get a hair transplant to do this exact process, right? To get the hair transplant, make their hairline more resistant to DHT and other derivatives so that they don't have to take medication, so they don't have to be super laborious with their hair stuff, right? There's a lot of stuff you do out there. There's derma rollers, there's topical ointments, there's all sorts of medications that you use, all the things from tretinoin to, I mean, it gets crazy. That's for another video. I've actually made videos on that in this channel, so you're more than welcome to watch those. But the reason I wanted to make this video is because you could have a hair transplant, you could have a friend who has a hair transplant, something like this, and they might stop taking that 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. They're still going to present with more balding. Their hair transplant doesn't cover their whole surface of their head, and so you will still have a experience of hair loss. It's not like you're going to be infinitely invulnerable to these issues. You're still going to have them. You'll just have some hair follicles, which won't make nearly enough of your scalp up to have a dense set of hair, that are going to be less exposed to DHT and hair follicle miniaturization, but a possibly grand majority of the hair follicles on your scalp are going to be susceptible to DHT, shrinking that hair follicle. So the reason that Chris Bumstead's hairpiece is failing is because he got either a shitty protocol done with some surgeon, or he's just not taking the 5-alpha reductase inhibitors anymore. Or maybe he's doing other things too. He might not be taking minoxidil, or maybe there's other things on top of the 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, but I would guarantee almost entirely that it is a limitation of a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor causing a rebound of hair loss.